Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Sandro DeMeo. I'd like to just start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on today. I'm in Northcote, so for me, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and their elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge any First Nations leaders, listeners, thinkers, and community members who are tuning into this across Australia and maybe beyond. And of course, I think as always, as we speak about food and our global food systems, we need to remember that for more than 60,000 years, the oldest continuous culture has existed on the land that I live, the land that always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and the deep connection that our Aboriginal Australians have and continue to have with food systems and sustainability. As I said, my name is Dr. Sandro DeMeo. I'm the CEO of Vic Health and the founder of a small foundation that really focuses on bringing big conversations around food and food systems to Australian kids, but also to families more broadly, and I suppose specifically today, hopefully to a lot of parents as well. I want to give a big shout out to the City of Melbourne, to the incredible team, Georgia, and the entire team for making this happen. We have an amazing cast of speakers today. We have about an hour to talk about such a critical topic. I just want to start, for those who visually impaired, I just want to start by describing myself, which is always a very harrowing or slightly scary thing to do, but I'm approximately 6 foot tall. I've got brown hair and eyes. I'm an Italian-Australian descent. I have clear glasses. I have long hair, very long hair because of lockdowns in Melbourne, a long time since a haircut. I'm wearing a black t-shirt and a tweed jacket, and behind me I've got the logos of Future Healthy and Vic Health, and a wonderful Mariam Isa print that I brought back from my years of living in Scandinavia. I want to start also just by acknowledging the incredible work of Carlos Montero and just bring you a few words that I think really paint the picture, Professor Carlos Montero of the University of Sao Paulo, that paint the picture of what we're talking about today. He says so clearly that ultra-processed foods are not real food. They are formulations of food substances, often modified by chemical processes and then assembled into ready-to-consume, hyper-palatable food and drink products using flavors, colors, emulsifiers, and a myriad of other cosmetic additives. They're typically high-energy, dense products, high in sugar, unhealthy fats and salt, low in dietary fiber, protein, vitamins, and minerals. He describes, a practical way to identify these foods is to check and see if its list of ingredients contain at least one characteristic of an ultra-processed food, which is to say either food substances that are rarely or never used in your kitchen. Most of us can't even pronounce them, things like high fructose corn syrup, hydrogenated, or I can't even say interterrestrified oils and hydrolyzed proteins, or classes of additives designed to make the final product palatable and more appealing. Most are made and promoted by transnational and giant corporations, and their ultra processing makes them highly profitable, intensely appealing, and intrinsically unhealthy. Ultra-processed foods already make up more than half of the total dietary energy consumed in high-income countries such as the USA, Canada, and the UK, and about 42% of energy intake here in Australia. But also, concerningly, these are becoming a global norm. Between 1/5 and 1/3 of total dietary intake in middle-income countries such as Brazil, Mexico, and Chile are now from ultra-processed foods. So what actually are ultra-processed foods? Where do they come from? Why do they now dominate our shelves, our pantries, and our plates? Who benefits and who loses? What impacts is it having on our health and the health of our planet? And finally, what can be done about it? Well, today for you, we have an all-star global cast, some incredible leading thinkers from around the world, but particularly here in Melbourne and Victoria. And to start us off, I want to take you to New York, where we will listen for a moment to Joe Jewell, who uses he, him pronouns and works as UNICEF's nutrition section in their global headquarters in New York on childhood overweight and obesity prevention and food systems, and has an expertise across many food systems around the world and the practice of changing those. He's going to tell us a little bit about the background, but also give us an insight into the UN Global Food Systems Summit that has happened this last month, where leaders around the world came to New York to talk about the very issues we're going to tackle today and what can be done next. Over to Joe.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. My name is Joe Jewell, and I'm a nutrition specialist at UNICEF, based in New York. I'm around 6 foot tall, I have dark blonde hair, and I'm wearing a striped light blue shirt. I'm really happy to be joining you today as part of these monthly Melbourne Conversations to tackle head-on the global challenge of ultra-processed foods and their harmful impact on the health of our planet and people, especially children. Currently, ultra-processed foods, which typically include high levels of free sugars and unhealthy oil, fats, and salt, are the most rapidly growing segment of our globe's diet, dominating the food supplies of various high-income countries and increasingly more pervasive in low middle-income countries. Ultra-processed foods make up more than 50% of the diet in some high-income countries and around 30% in middle-income countries. Businesses producing these products are rapidly expanding their operations in middle-income countries, where they see lots of room to increase market share. This makes sense due to their additives and formulations that not only make ultra-processed foods cheap and easy to produce, but also very convenient and palatable for consumers, particularly when they're heavily marketed to them. Unfortunately, there is a large and continuously expanding body of evidence that demonstrates that these products are problematic for both our planet and our health. From an environmental lens, ultra-processed foods are considered to be an underlying driver of climate change and environmental degradation, since their production involves many processing steps, longer transport distances, and extensive packaging, which is a major source of waste. And as ultra-processed foods continue to replace freshly prepared meals and minimally processed foods, their harmful impact on our health and nutrition is growing more obvious. We know that it's products like these that are helping to drive the growing global burden of overweight and obesity, in addition to diet-related non-communicable diseases. At the center of these problematic trends are children. Not only does environmental degradation and climate change put the children at risk today and in the future, but children's health and nutrition are also bearing the brunt of this growing consumption of ultra-processed food. The increasing availability of ultra-processed foods is adversely affecting children's diets and food preferences, and thus their health outcomes. Ultra-processed foods are constantly marketed to children. These products are also designed to be tasty and convenient, which makes it difficult for children to learn and access, afford, or desire healthy alternatives. Ultra-processed foods, from the way they are produced, marketed, and sold, violate children's rights from an early age. Childhood is a critical time when food preferences and eating habits are formed with long-lasting effects on health. If children begin to consume ultra-processed foods and have an unhealthy dietary start early in life, particularly in terms of weight gain, this tends to trace into adolescence and then adulthood. We also know from studies in Nepal, Indonesia, and Ethiopia, for example, that the consumption of ultra-processed foods in many low and middle-income country settings can contribute to micronutrient deficiencies when they replace more nutritious foods in the diets of young children. The global presence of ultra-processed foods emphasizes the need for coordinated action both within and between countries to secure healthier food environments for children. These include policies on the taxation of ultra-processed foods while subsidizing minimally processed foods to make healthier options more affordable and available. Other priority policies include front-of-pack nutrition labeling to warn consumers about harmful ingredients and nutritional composition, in addition to restricting the ultra-processed food marketing and promotions, especially those that target children explicitly. Our new nutrition reality is being driven by this growing global consumption of ultra-processed foods, and we need to act swiftly to ensure food systems work for both our planet and our children. As we move forward together post the UN Food Systems Summit and towards the upcoming Global Nutrition for Growth Summit, there needs to be stronger global coordination to address these concerning trends. The evidence on the negative health and environmental impacts of ultra-processed food is clear, and we know the package of policies that are most effective, especially when it comes to protecting children. I'm looking forward to learning from today's conversation, and thank you for the invitation to speak to you today.
Well, thanks so much, Joe. If you've just joined us, my name is Dr. Sandro DeMeo, and you're watching Melbourne Conversations, the rise of ultra-processed food, as part of Melbourne's Conversations series run by the City of Melbourne on the third Wednesday of every month. You can submit your questions throughout the event, and we'd really encourage that, and we'll answer some of those at the end of our panel discussion. Submit your questions by going to sly.do and entering the hashtag ultraprocessed, one word lowercase. Or you can use the link or the QR code that is now on your screens. You can also subscribe to this Melbourne Knowledge Week YouTube channel to stay up to date with future Melbourne Conversation events. Thanks very much, Joe, and I'm going to now take us to our first panelist. Georgi Skrinis uses he, him pronouns and is an Associate Professor of Food Politics and Policy at the University of Melbourne, whose research focus includes the health impacts of ultra-processed foods and the power of the corporations that produce them. So over to you, Georgi, really for what are ultra-processed foods? Are they all equal? And how have they come to dominate our global diets? Thanks, Georgi.
Thanks, Sandra, and thanks for the invitation to speak today. And just a brief description of myself. I've got short, dark hair. I'm wearing black glasses today and a blue shirt. So look, I think it is really important to define this term ultra-processed food, which was coined by, as you mentioned, Carlos Monteiro from Brazil. Now, we are talking about both packaged foods and fast foods, and indeed, most of the packaged foods in the supermarket, the processed packaged foods that is, would be classified ultra-processed. That's what our studies are telling us. And a lot of the fast foods from the sort of the large fast food chains would also be classified that way. So we're talking about snack foods and soft drinks, confectionery. Perhaps that's a bit obvious, but even just breads and breakfast cereals and ready meals, pastries can also be and often are ultra processed if they're produced often by the large corporations. So in terms of the definition, these are a new category of foods. We can think of them that way. They're not just processed foods which happen to be high in salt, sugar, and fat. Because that's the old way which we used to, and nutritionists used to identify the sort of problematic processed foods. So it's not about salt, sugar, and fat, it's about the way they're processed and the various additives and so on. So these are foods which are really built up out of very cheap ingredients like refined grains and vegetable oils and sugar and soy and processed meats and so on. And then they're highly processed through a range of processing techniques. They're really broken down to their component parts, chemically transformed, and then built back up again. And then, of course, additives, artificial additives. And the role of these additives is really important. They're there to provide flavour and texture and colour as well. Because all those characteristics have been taken out and through the very degrading sort of processing techniques they've been put through. So the additives are really there to make them taste and look good and actually to make them look like food. So that's a really important point. And that highlights the fact that perhaps we can say they're not really foods at all because they're actually trying to mimic foods and to think of them as a different category. Now, these foods also are, in the end, high in salt, sugar, and fat. And once again, these are added to give flavour and texture and bulk and so on, and to keep them cheap. But we shouldn't be distracted by thinking that's the main problem with these, because there are other problems that come with these foods, health consequences, because of all these the processing that goes on. And apart from any sort of direct health impact that might come from these foods, another way of thinking about them simply is that they're not very nutritious to begin with. And that's a concern when they start to displace the sort of more minimally processed and other processed foods from our diet. And that's exactly what has been happening all around the world, and that's what our studies are telling us. And we've done many of these sort of country studies around the world. In Australia, as Sandra mentioned, 42% on average of the diet is ultra-processed food, so nearly half. But that average conceals real variation amongst the population. And in fact, one-fifth of the population are consuming close to 3/4 or 80% of their diet is ultra-processed, almost the entirety of their diets. So that is quite dramatic. And and also if you break it down by age group, our children and adolescents and young adults are amongst the highest consumers in Australia. So that should be a concern, what we're feeding our children. It's a similar picture around the world in high-income countries. In the USA and the UK, it's over 50% ultra-processed foods. But as has already been mentioned, it's the low and middle income countries where at the moment it might be between 20 and 30% ultra processed, depending on the country, but rising rapidly. And that's exactly the countries that the large corporations are now targeting to increase their sales. Now, in terms of what's driving this consumption, now partly it's the products themselves, and they're designed to drive consumption, partly because they're cheap, because they're made out of cheap ingredients, and there's the convenience factor from the packaging and so on. But they're also designed to be super tasty, if not sort of quasi addictive. And they're also very quick to consume because they're so highly processed, and you can consume them quickly, and that tends to promote overconsumption as well. So that's a concern in itself. But standing behind all that is the very large food corporations that produce much of these foods. And we are talking about large corporations. We're not talking about small processing companies or restaurants or cafes, and they're certainly not being produced in the home. And it's these large companies which have the resources to put a lot of energy into innovation, designing these products so they are so convenient and tasty and so on, producing them really cheaply by sourcing the ingredients globally, distributing them widely, making them absolutely ubiquitous in our lives, and they're everywhere you go, and of course very aggressively marketing these products. But alongside that also, these companies have enormous power, including political power and power to influence government policy. And once again, we're seeing that, and that explains why I think there's very few policies restricting the production and sale of these products around the world, but particularly in Australia. There's a near absence of policies regulating these products in Australia. So I think, going forward, we need to think about what policies targeting these sort of products look like. They don't not just trying to reduce the salt, sugar, and fat content. Because what our studies are telling us is it's the total amount of ultra-processed foods consumed that lead to some of these health and dietary impacts, not the particular products we consume. And it's not the particular ingredients either. They're a broad category of food. And so it is about reducing the total levels of production and consumption. I'll leave it there. Thanks,
Georgie. Thanks, Georgie. Next, I want to go to Vanessa. Vanessa Clarkson uses she, her pronouns, and is a food systems consultant and advisor, public health nutritionist, and award-winning author in infant and child nutrition. Vanessa, Georgie paints a pretty scary picture, but what does this mean for the health of people and planet? Why does it matter?
Thanks, Sandro. Hello, everyone. I'm Vanessa Clarkson. I have dark brown hair and slightly wonky glasses always, and I'm wearing a brown pattern dress. It's a pleasure to be involved in today's discussion. I shall try my best to lead on from Georgie and pull out some of the key issues that come to mind when thinking about the burdens that ultra-processed foods place on communities and the planet. And I've got about 4 minutes to do that, so I'll kick off. So for me, the concept of ultra-processed food really realises that old adage that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So rather than it being about the specific components of foods leading to specific health effects in a really linear way, which is how we've looked at these foods for a long time, as Georgie mentioned, this is much more about being more than about the nutrients or even necessarily the ingredients. The framing is much more holistic, a holistic way of thinking about the health effects of how we feed ourselves. And so to me, that draws me to think about systems. So that's natural systems, body systems, food systems, which of course we separate, but they're all very much deeply interconnected. So when we're thinking about the health effects, it's really thinking about how the food system is structured in a way to make these foods ultra-processed by design and creates these problems as a matter of course, that the problems are really built into the structure of the system. And actually, I start to wonder if we should perhaps reframe the value chain, as we always call it, to the cost chain, because these costs start at the outset and then they just build up and outwards as we go through. So in terms of the health effects of the system that produces ultra-processed foods right across, so they're not only confined to our communities who experience higher rates of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and so on, all of these that have been connected to the consumption of these products, But if you trace ultra-processed foods back into the corporate food system where they come from, you know, these products are the children of industrial agriculture. So large-scale monocropping operations use large amounts of non-renewable inputs, including agrochemicals that come from fossil fuels, pesticides, fertilizers, and so on. You know, it's a very energy and resource intensive way of getting our food. It's damaging soil and aquatic ecosystems. And in Australia, the system that generates these foods contributes over a third of environmental damage that's related to the foods that we eat. So it's not just greenhouse gas emissions, it's water scarcity and it's changing land use. Another critical issue of industrial agriculture is that it contributes to biodiversity losses, and that affects the health and resilience of natural systems. And the declines that we see in biodiversity across the natural world are also in us, of course, because we are part of the natural world and not separate. So the plethora of ultra-processed foods creates this illusion of diversity when you walk into a supermarket, and as Georgi said, most of the foods sold are ultra-processed. That's actually an illusion of diversity. They're actually made from a very small number of commodity crops that are just put together in different ways. And so you can follow these threads through. You can look then at our microbiota. So that's the system of microorganisms that live in our gut. And these are affected by the foods as well. And they're affected in many ways, not just because of the nutrients and the way that they're processed, many ways that we just don't even have a full grasp on. And so this way of food disrupts our systems. It disrupts us. It disrupts the natural systems. And we know that dietary patterns leave an imprint on us as well that passes on to future generations through our epigenome. So it's not just about what's happening now, but it imprints on us and becomes part of future generations. The other point as well that I think is just worth mentioning as an aside, and it's not even a small aside, is that it's not just the foods themselves. Waste aside, which is a huge issue, the packaging that these products come in contain many hormone disrupting chemicals. And these are now considered a serious and urgent threat to public health by many leading public health organisations. And finally, these health burdens are not shared equally. They affect historically disadvantaged communities to a greater extent. And the degradation of ecosystems, which is in some cases irreversible, and climate change, of course, not only affects people and other living beings that are around today, but it also affects those that aren't even born yet. So for me, this is also a rights issue, and our food system as it is structured is violating human rights and the rights of the earth to flourish. So I welcome what can start as what seems quite a small reframing. I welcome this because I think it avoids this trap of what I would call irreversible emphasis. So being too focused on a specific, designing products to deal with a specific, rather than losing sight of the general, which is the whole system.
Wow, thank you so much, Vanessa. And I did say we have an all-star cast panel today, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions. Just a reminder, you can submit your questions throughout the events using Slido and using the hashtag ultra-processed, one word, lowercase, using the link or the QR code that you can see on your screen. So submit those questions. We'll take those in a second. But Vanessa left us at the perfect stage to come to you, Mariam. Mariam Isa uses she, her pronouns and is a speaker, author, storyteller and community builder, and co-founder and president of a community initiative called RAW that connects refugees, migrants and local community through her community garden, cooking and conversations. And so, Mariam, I want to really ask you, pick up on that piece around human rights and social justice. So what does all of this mean that we've just heard from Georgi and Vanessa for consumers, individuals, parents? But what we also know is that the weight of these products, health and environmental, are not borne equally across society. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Thank you, Sandro, for inviting me to this platform. My name is Mariam. I'm an African woman, curly red hair. And yeah, so as a storyteller, first of all, I just want to invite everyone into this powerful circle of grace, because I think when we sit in a circle of grace, we can invite, we can bring our grievances into this circle and deal with them. And I feel that we are in a grieving world, and a lot of our systems are broken, and especially the food system. So for me, how I see food is actually about linking our humanity. It's about connecting to each other, but also respecting each other. And I feel that when these systems are weakened, then our respect for each other is weakened, our connection is weakened, and our humanity is weakened. So coming to Australia as a refugee, and having come from really beautiful culture that we grew our own food. So I didn't grow up with ultra processed food. I just saw, came and saw it in the West. And so I came to Australia with 4 children, and I had my 5th child in this country. And to me, the first time I came and shopping for 5 children in a supermarket was very overwhelming. I used to go to the market every morning. We used to buy from the local community. Actually, I grew up among a culture called the Giriamas, who were the native lands of Malindi, a small town in Kenya. And I remember that when my family, my mother, migrated to that small town, the chief of the town really called her and gave her a plot of land and said, cultivate this land for your children. But my mother, having come from nomadic traditions, being new into a new culture, didn't trust that. And she felt that she didn't trust the people she had come to. She didn't speak the language. And so she said no to the land. And I remember that our neighbors, when the harvest season came, we were never excluded. The harvest came to our doors. And once my mom saw that, she then started a small tuck shop at our home. She started cooking the Somali food and interacting with the community. So for me, what I feel that I saw in that was the respect. She appreciated how she was respected in this new community. And some 20 odd years later, I came to Australia as a stranger, just like my mother. And lo and behold, I was also given that plot of land in the form of a housing commission, and in the heart of Brighton, where it was all white. The culture was so different from mine. And so for me, I feel that seed of love that had been seeded while I was growing up really germinated in this backyard. And I know that no one ever is anywhere randomly. We are always called to the places that we come to. And so for me, I started that I've seen people who had forgotten to be communal, who had forgotten to interact. And it was the gift that I feel the West gave me, was to remember my individuality. But the gift that I gave back was to connect the community, to bring my communal culture and to connect them. So I feel that justice actually is linked to respect. And when people have this beautiful, when you connect with yourself, because we are what we eat. Food is much more than what we think. Food is what gives us our immunity as a species. And if those systems are degraded, and the way Vanessa, beautifully described for in the degradation of the soil and all that, and when we lose respect for the earth, we've lost respect for ourselves, and hence we are not giving the future generation an opportunity to remember, and we're not actually seeding love. And now in my backyard I have 40 fruit trees, and my next door neighbors' children come and they do their composting. Their mothers send them here, and they do, they garden with us, and I tell them stories. I tell them stories of how humbling it is when you just, when you're weeding and you see that worm in the earth, you walk on earth differently. And so I feel that, this beautiful, compassionate conversation is here to remind us of our humanity and to strengthen our food systems, because when this chain is weakened here, it is also weakened in other parts. So we're so intertwined and interconnected. And I feel that for me, the lessons that I have learned of individuality and communal, dependency and individuality don't work on their own by themselves. But when we combine them, we have this interconnected world. And once we have self-actualized ourselves and we respect what we put in our mouths, we respect what we eat, then we strengthen our immunity. So I feel that this is an invitation and a call to our humanity, to strengthen it and to be so much stronger, I feel, as a community. And I think the pandemic has really shown us what it's like in these times, and how important it is that we link and we collaborate and we celebrate. Because after, when we come together on the table and we eat food together, that's a big celebration. And that's what I do in my backyard, in the linking of the two continents that I'm part of. Thank you, Sandra.
That's awesome, Mariam. Wow. It's no wonder we're fast becoming such great friends. And I think it really resonates again what Vanessa was saying about, it's more than the sum of the parts, because it's the culture, it's the connection, it's all the other pieces that come with food. And as soon as we start reshaping or replacing those traditional diets and all the goodness that comes with that is not even just related to the nutrition, so much begins to get lost. So finally, I want to go to Ali, our last panel speaker, and then we'll open up for questions. So do submit your questions via Slido now. Ali is an incredible leader also in the Australian and international domain. Ali is a doctor, goes by she, her pronouns, and is a researcher and public health lawyer with a PhD at the Georgia Institute for Global Health, where she works on policies to promote healthier and more sustainable diets. And Ali, as a lawyer and a public health professional, give us some hope. What are the solutions? Where is change happening, and what can Australia be doing better or doing differently to take us to a healthier, more sustainable future?
Thanks, Sandro. So just for clarity, for those who may be watching with visual impairments, I'm sitting in Sydney with long brown hair that's freshly cut because I've been very lucky to get out for the first time in 6 months, and I'm wearing a navy blouse. So I should clarify that I'm not a medical doctor, but my PhD is in public health. And I really work on policies to promote healthy and sustainable diets. So for me, this is a fascinating area because we have all of this building evidence now of the health harms of ultra-processed products, the environmental harms, and we have this growing consumer awareness about those things. And that's why we're here today discussing this with such a great audience. And I think, what Mariam just shared is really beautiful and an example of somebody who is reconnected with the food system. But I think for most of us, it's not just enough to make us aware of these products. If our food environment is still totally dominated by ultra-processed foods, if every supermarket shelf I go, look at, if every ad I see, if all the products in the school canteen are ultra-processed, it's really difficult for even motivated people to make change. So my work is really about the policies that we need to shift the balance of diets back towards fresh and minimally processed foods. And that includes, really starting from infancy, so protecting breastfeeding, for example, from the invasion of these kinds of products. I think the good news is that the answers here will be good for both health and the environment. So, for example, instead of growing the commodity crops that Vanessa spoke about that are the inputs into ultra-processed products, we need to be growing a more diverse range of fresh foods in sustainable ways, in the kinds of ways that Mariam's practicing at home, but we need to be doing on a local scale and bigger for all of us. But especially instead of allowing big food to inappropriately market ultra-processed foods to us everywhere, we really need to be enacting policies that support the consumption of healthy whole foods. And I think one key opportunity for that now in Australia is the revision of the Australian Dietary Guidelines. So the ones we have were issued in 2013, and most of this evidence on ultra-processing has really rapidly accumulated since then. And so now, as we review the dietary guidelines, it's really critical that we get in this evidence about the processing and that we make recommendations accordingly. And that's important in the dietary guidelines, but it's also important because the dietary guidelines underpin other policies like labelling or school food guidelines. And if we look at countries like France, for example, or Brazil and Canada, they have done this. So the French government is aiming for a 20% reduction in ultra-processed foods in their national diet, which is one place to start. Given how much of our diet it makes up, we're really going to have to chip away at that. I think Brazil's dietary guidelines are another very different example to what Australia currently has. So they start by saying, make the natural or minimally processed foods the basis of your diet. They say to limit processed foods and avoid ultra-processed foods altogether. So right now in Australia, our definition of unhealthy is still linked to those nutrients that we talked about earlier. So things that are high in added salt, sugars and fat. I think, that's not unusual. It's still aligned with the World Health Organization current recommendations, but it is getting out of date. I don't think we need to throw out everything we know about those nutrients because they are a really good marker of a bad food and a processed food. It's really what Vanessa said, which is that the whole is more than the sum of the parts. So we need to factor in the nutrients, but also encapsulate this idea of processing to get into policies so that we're genuinely recommending the whole healthy foods. So I might stop there and leave it open for questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Ali. So that brings us to the end of the opening, sort of setting the scene. There's a lot there, a lot to digest, so to speak, a lot on our plate. No, I'll stop now. We're going to open up now to some questions from the audience, and a number of them have come through. Really great questions. Again, you can submit your questions through Slido. Use the link that's available to you there, and you can submit those live. So the first question comes from Anonymous. 50 years ago, the average cost of food in comparison to other household expenditure was much higher. Should we be looking at the messaging that food should be cheap? And how does this interact with questions of financial accessibility for populations that are already experiencing financial strain? And I would just say, in the context of food insecurity near doubling in Australia since the pandemic began, who wants to take that question?
I'm happy to have a go. I'll have a go.
Nervous silence. Go for it. Thanks, Vanessa.
I'm happy to have a go. When Mariam was speaking, I was reminded of that lovely quote from Mary Oliver, attention is the beginning of devotion. And so I think that sort of, for me, messaging around anything that cheapens something that is so central to life is damaging, and that damages our relationship with that. It's definitely not devoting ourselves to something when we're cheapening it. And if you think of how those sort of messages over time, I mean, where all that came from was this idea that we need to, end hunger. We need to make lots of food. It needs to be cheaply available. But of course, that has all the policies that wrap around those have a structuring effect on the system. And that has really contributed to how we've got to a system where we are today that didn't emerge out of thin air. It was molded and shaped through policies over the years. And a lot of that was driven by an agenda to cheapen food, to make it low cost. And of course, now we can see the burdens that's put in, that actually it's not any food at any cost. It's not any food at low cost. It's really important, the sorts of foods that we're nourishing ourselves, and it's also important how we go about doing that. And I think we're starting to see that actually it's not just about ending hunger, but it's about nourishing communities. And so just to loop back, that sort of messaging around let's make food cheaper is really damaging on so many levels, and it's really contributing to the way that the system is structured. But it is certainly about supporting access and affordability. People should have the means to acquire nourishing foods, however that may be, whether it's from a shop or whether they grow it themselves or whether they grow it as a community. People should have the means to be able to do that, but not by cheapening foods to give access to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to come to you, Ali. So you talked about the kind of structural changes that these sort of paradigms cause, but how do you reverse those? So, I mean, what do we do in terms of making it more affordable, but not necessarily focusing on making it always as cheap as possible? What are the policy levers, Ali?
Yeah, well, like Vanessa said, I mean, price is a major determinant of what food we buy. Taste is, there's a whole variety of things, but price is definitely a major reason why we buy things. And right now, the whole system is set up to incentivize the production of these kinds of cheap, unhealthy foods. And so we really do need to shift the system. And one way we can do that is with structural policies like taxation or subsidies. So making the price of an ultra-processed food accurately reflect the actual cost of that food on our health and on the environment, which is not currently reflected in the sticker price that you see when you buy a product like that. And so at the same time as we may make those foods more expensive, we also can subsidise the healthier foods to shift people in the other direction. I mean, we do that to some extent in the GST. For example, it doesn't apply to fresh fruit and vegetables, so that is the equivalent of making them 10% cheaper. But we could do a lot more. And I mean, countries around the world are doing much more innovative stuff than us in this space. So most countries, for example, have a tax, or not, there's at least 50 countries that have a tax on sugar-sweetened beverages, which are a very good example of an ultra-processed food that's completely unnecessary in our diet. It's sold in a plastic bottle that's not good for our environment. That's just one narrow example. We could at least start there, but at the same time, we do really want to make the healthier foods cheaper so that, the diet as a whole is affordable for all.
Mariam, what are your thoughts in terms of this tension between increasing the accessibility and affordability, but also ultimately not driving the quality of the product or foods to such a point that they themselves are so cheap to produce, not necessarily to buy, that they come ultimately at a cost, and often, ironically, at a cost to those that are starting off in the most marginalised positions?
Yeah, and I think this comes back to strengthening our communities and how we interact with each other. I think that for me, in the field that I am in, connecting community, I see that there is an understanding, and we're going back. We're actually remembering ourselves. And by connecting, there is so much possibility. Like, people start to have a conversation, and people are starting to open up their backyards as well. There's elders who own a really big, nice plot of land, and then they invite people to come in and, do the work on their land. There's beehive, people who are taking working on beehives on someone's property. For instance, in our community garden, we have 2 beehives, but we don't manage it. It's managed by someone who's outside of it. So I think when we eat right, our creativity kind of, comes up as well. So we think creatively, and we can come up with incredible solutions in that. But first, we need to connect. I think what we've lost, in the system of food, is that there's not much connection. When we connect to our farmers, they have excess food. If you go and help them with some of the work as a working bee of a community, then they give you some food. So there's all that, bartering system that we can bring back.
Awesome. There are a lot of questions that come in about specific policies. So a few ask, what would be an ideal scheme for a front of pack labelling approach in Australia to promote public health effectively and honestly? And how can consumer activists and lobby groups ensure that these guidelines, the guidelines that we're currently developing, are not created in collaboration with maybe forces that go against, or counter to public health priorities? Georgi, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of front of pack labelling, I mean, the health star rating system we have in Australia, we do need to ask why it was designed the way it was, and why does it not seem to be working very well? Why was the industry involved in developing this labelling system? So real question marks there. because it does a really bad job of identifying the poor quality foods. And it's almost designed not to. It's almost designed to fudge the boundaries between what is an ultra-processed food and minimally processed foods. And that's partly about the sort of the nutritional algorithm which underpins it, which could be improved. But I think there are inherent problems with that sort of star rating system anyway. And there are better systems around the world which we could turn to. And they are things like the Chilean warning label, front of pack label, which is now also being adopted by Mexico, which is, they're still nutrient based. So there's limitations there, just focusing on salt, sugar and fat. And I think that's quite reductive, focusing on those elements. Nevertheless, they do highlight when a food is high in one of those components, and that's usually a good sign that it probably is ultra processed. The other thing is, of course, with these front of pack labeling systems, it's just a front of pack label, just information. And that's, I think we need to be really going beyond just giving information. And in the case of in Chile and Mexico, these warning labels are linked to actual hard policies which restrict the sale of these products in schools, and they restrict the marketing to children. So they're sort of backed up by other sort of types of policies. And I think that's where we need to be moving to, because it's not just about, you know, allowing the companies to produce these foods and then trying to convince people not to buy them through taxes or labeling systems. Why not just restrict the production of these foods and restrict their distribution, restrict their sale right from the get-go, if we all agree that they're not very nutritious foods?
I'm going to have to keep moving because there's so many great questions. Another question is coming. How important is it to eliminate any and all non-naturally occurring ingredients entirely in children's diets? So is the end goal of all of this to eliminate anything out of the diets of children that is not naturally occurring? Interesting question. Vanessa, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Well, look, I mean, humans evolved over, 2.5 million years, and these are relatively new items into our diet. So there is certainly no sort of physiological space, if you like, for these products, because we simply haven't evolved capacity to deal with them, if you want a really scientific answer. But if you want sort of a more realistic answer in terms of what's achievable, I have 3 boys, and I certainly am not even going to attempt that battle of trying to convince them to not like chocolate or to not like crisps or whatever it might be, because we have huge changes to make, but these are going to take a long, long time. But what I can do is really grow that love of real food with them, so that they really appreciate and know. My son asked me this morning, can I have raspberries in my lunchbox? And I was like, no, because it's not raspberry season. We don't have raspberries at this time of year, but you can have an apple. Why is there no raspberry? And so I think there's lots more that, other things that we can be doing as parents that we can be focusing on. I think these sorts of conversations sometimes can put these products into a box that stigmatizes them, and it's not really a helpful place for parents or for communities, because actually they're so embedded in our way of life that it's not just a case for people that can just draw them out and swap them with something else. That tends to put the burden back on women, who have to do more of the home cooking in reality. And there's definitely a gender divide there. So I don't know that that's answered the question really.
Oh, that's all right.
These products, they're going to creep in, right? So, but let's just keep the focus on the real food and not try to denigrate these. Like, it's very good, not very good, but it's all well and good for us to have these conversations when we're thinking about policy and changing the system and drawing it away from that. But I think when we're talking to our children, it's more nuanced than that, and we should be careful with the language that we use.
Yeah. There's a question here, but before I go to that, Mariam, do you want to add it? I know this is an area that you're an expert in, so I feel as though you might want to add just a very quick comment as well.
Yeah, so my simple comment is seeding, how important it is to seed that love of and connection to our children and community. And it's not so hard for children to, they actually love it, to go back into the garden and to touch, to play with the soil and to play with the worms and, to compost. And then you show them this process. It's actually fascinating for children. And that's a way of growing their mind. And I think when they have that link with the food, then they actually will bring answers as well. We diminish children sometimes in thinking that we know better, but children can be brought into this conversation and ask them their opinions and what they think of what they eat. So
that's great.
Making them part of the
I love the analogy again. It's sort of nudging, Georgie was talking about these foods and nudging traditional diets off the plate. And I feel like Vanessa, you and Miriam are nudging them back on again, and displacing them almost. They seem like two disparate conversations, but I'm starting to really see the links. There's a single very quick question here. Would new plant-based range of foods fabricated to closely resemble meat fall under the range of ultra-processed foods? I just want a yes or a no from you, Georgie.
They are. If they do have those high ultra-processed ingredients and additives, quite simply they are.
They are. Okay. It shows the complexity of all this. Question for you, Ali. If higher income countries and the legacy of colonialism created this problem, what responsibilities do these countries now have to remedy the situation globally?
Small question. I think great question though. I mean, right now globally, we have also given a platform for the transnational companies that are here to get more and more power, and globally they have power in the international and the UN systems too. If you look at the International Food Standards Agency, there's a lot of behaviour there from big food companies who are influencing global standards. So I think we do have a responsibility to try and shift the power, because now those companies are going around the world and changing the diets of countries who have traditional diets that are more based on these minimally processed foods that were healthy, and now we're sort of exporting diabetes to the world and things like this. So I think we do have a responsibility in terms of how to change. I mean, I think we could start by changing here at home. We don't have policies that seriously address this. We do allow those companies a seat at the policy table. I would just add one thing to an earlier question about how can we keep them out of the Dietary Guidelines Committee. I would really applaud the government for making the announcement recently about the body that's going, the committee that's going to review those guidelines, and it does not involve the food industry, and it does involve a governance committee that will specifically look at conflicts of interest. So I think the more we can kind of recognise this in international power structures, the more we can get sort of the evidence as guiding the way in policy and get a better outcome for everyone.
Awesome. You can see why I was so excited by this conversation today. Georgie, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just to, add to that, all these large transnational corporations, they are all based, or almost all based in the United States, North America, or Europe. So they are, rich country corporations. And so in a sense, this is a form of neo-colonialism. And what has enabled it is globalization, but trade policies which have opened up the global south to these companies. So that is a way of addressing it as well, tightening up those trade policies.
So there's a great question here from Travis, thanks Georgie, that relates to this conversation. So what does a structure that facilitates a fairer, more sustainable eating look like? Can we move the profit motive from production, distribution, and retail? And I'd love to hear from any of you, but maybe I'll start, Ali, with yourself. But Mariam, I'd love to come to you in a second to talk about, what does this structure look like at the community level, and maybe also Vanessa. So first to you, Ali.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question, and it really comes back to the systems that Vanessa highlighted earlier. So all of this stuff happens in a system, and currently our food systems are set up all throughout the chain in terms of the production, the distribution, the way it's sold, all incentivizes these unhealthy ultra-processed products being the things that turn the most profits, being the things that are the most available. And we need to shift levers all throughout that system to change the way that food is grown. I mean, in in terms of what that structure looks like. That's what the UN Food Systems Summit was meant to be discussing. It was transformation of global food systems. It's not an easy topic, and it's really contested. So, but I think we can start with policies that are recommended that we, in Australia, we haven't done, for example. So there are a whole list of global recommendations that we could start with. It would be changing the way food's marketed, changing the way it's grown, changing the way it's sold, to put those healthy whole foods back in the centre stage, and make those other ones less appealing to make.
Mariam?
I think, when one of the things that I really loved when I first came and, after the supermarket is a friend took me to a farmer's market. And I remembered, when you are shopping, in supermarkets and when you're shopping in a market, there's the difference, in a market, you see people, you see chaos, you see things that are natural to our, to our humanity. And then you're in a supermarket and it's all sterile, and there's music and there's these fluorescent lights and there's all that, drive that for you to buy more. And especially if you go there hungry, it's crazy. So I think that, farmers markets, small businesses. I have a really good friend who owns an organization called I'm a Local. He is connected to the local farmers, to the local bakeries, and he only sources food that is of the season. So I think there's a really great opportunity there for, bringing back the economy of people and, connecting with each other more.
Lovely. I love it. Bringing back the economy of people and connection. Georgi, sorry, you were giving me a little subtle sign.
Yeah, look, I very much agree with Mariam there, because it is about getting out of the supermarket, and it's not just though about doing all the cooking yourself. We need to find processed foods, other people who prepare our foods for us that are just not ultra processed, but that are also affordable. So it is about supporting and encouraging smaller processors, finding ways of sharing food. So we're not all going back to the kitchen. That can't be the solution, and particularly with the gender issues around that as well. So it is about who's producing the food and where it's being produced and where we're shopping. And I don't think we've got any easy solutions to that at the moment, but it is about encouraging those small local producers of processed foods, not just of agricultural produce.
Amazing. There's a question here about we're getting very close to the end of time, so we're going to have to keep the questions a little bit, the answer a bit shorter, and then I have one very quick rapid fire question to finish. But Vanessa, this is a question for you. We're given busy lifestyles, and despite many of us knowing what is healthy or is unhealthy, we can dispute that or agree, but consumers continue to consume in larger and larger quantity convenience foods over whole foods. What element is there in terms of behaviour change? How do we shift diets? Where do the solutions lie? What would be your top 3 things you would do if you were the almighty chancellor of the world? Let's say, what are kind of 2 or 3 big things you think we could do to try and shift consumer behaviour towards healthier diets? Do you want a second to think about it?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh, that's a big question. I'll say that I'm really glad that the conversation has moved on to sort of thinking of structure, nudging. We want to just park the word nudging and thinking about how the structure. So that was my comment on that last thing that we were talking about. This is not an easy question to answer, because ultra processed foods are very interwoven with people's life worlds, and so there is no simple solutions here, because I really do feel that in as much as we need the system to be fundamentally restructured, which was what Ali was talking about, and that's what really we're trying to get to in our headspace. Also, people's life worlds, the way people lead their lives, has got to open up to accommodate that change as well. So there are little things you can do that I think we've spoken about, little things that have big impact, but seem sort of I don't know, like they're not going to do that, like involving children with growing food and so on, that changes people's mindsets. One thing that's really interesting around all of this, which was a theme that's come through, is this concept of socialization. And we get locked into this socialization, and over time these products infiltrate into our lives, and then our lives adapt and change around them, and we sort of fold in and lock them into place. So you have to first recognize that these are not sort of good foundations for a diet to start to unravel at, to find the time, to find the space, and to experiment with new ways of doing things. There's not three things.
Awesome.
But
no, that's great.
Yeah.
So we're basically out of time. The hour has disappeared, but I just want to ask each of you one practical thing that the audience can take away or do. Now, we understand that a lot of the solutions lie with government, so maybe it's through our democratic systems, maybe it's through local governments, maybe it's through getting involved in the food system, or indeed in your local community, as Mariam said. But what's something that we could all start to do in our lives over the coming weeks and months that might have a small impact on this very big challenge? I'm looking for one single sentence, if I can, from each of you. Ali, I'm going to put you on the spot because I know you're very good at that. You go first.
Yeah, I would say read food labels, and if a product has more than 5 ingredients and ones you can't pronounce, don't buy it.
Awesome. Mariam?
I would say, change your mind. You always have that opportunity, and look at, when you look at something, the way you look at it actually changes. So change your perception about the way you eat, because it's not just about
Awesome.
the food.
Awesome. Thank you. Georgie?
I'd say actually read more about how our foods are actually produced, including in the factory. So I guess just Google it and see what's actually in your foods.
And I would Google all of our panelists today. There are some fabulous articles on The Conversation, ABC, that they've written, and academic articles that they've written over the last few years. If you want to really, get yourself a chunky smorgasbord of all things ultra processed, the information, not the foods. Vanessa, last to you.
Go online, find your nearest local food producer you can buy a veggie box from, and order that and do that this week instead of one less trip to the supermarket.
Awesome. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's that time. Our hour is absolutely flashed past. I just want to really start by thanking Joe from New York, Ali, Mariam, Vanessa, and Georgie. A big thank you to also the City of Melbourne and Melbourne Conversations. Big thank you to all of those who submitted their questions. Thank you so much for joining us for this Melbourne Conversations event. The City of Melbourne runs these events on the third Wednesday of every month. The next event will be Melbourne Conversations, Our Inclusive Recovery. This event will be an opportunity to hear about and discuss some of the big ideas to help Melbourne recover from the past couple of years in a truly inclusive way. You can see details for future events by simply searching Melbourne Conversations on the City of Melbourne website. And don't forget to subscribe to this Melbourne Knowledge Week YouTube channel, wherever it is, over here, to stay up to date with all of the conversation events and the latest news. There's also a link in the YouTube chat to a survey, and the City of Melbourne team would love to hear your feedback on this event and also on others. But above all, at this very challenging and uncertain time, we wish everyone a really, really safe state. Wish everyone a very safe end to the year, and thank you once again for joining us, and goodbye.